Today's guest is a really great example of what happens when a podcast has a clear role, even when it doesn't follow the usual rules. The conversation around podcasting and business often get flattened into binaries: sell or don't sell, call to action or no call to action, talk about your offer or don't. But that framing misses something, because what actually makes a podcast work isn't whether you sell or not, it's whether the strategy behind it is meant to support the business. In today's episode, I talk with Rhona Pierce, the host of Workfluencer podcast. We talk about how she doesn't really talk about what she does on her podcast, but it is still deeply intentional. The guests she invites on, the conversations that she has, or how the podcast fits into her overall visibility and all works together. This episode isn't about copying her approach or throwing out what you've done or learned. It's about understanding how different strategies work for different businesses and what clarity looks like in practice. If you've ever wondered if you talk too much or not enough, or you might be asking the wrong questions, this conversation will give you a different lens. Most podcasters don't grow because they don't have a strategy. No more. Welcome to the show, Podcast to Grow, where I help coaches and entrepreneurs turn their podcast into their most powerful business tool. I'm Elena, and I'm breaking down exactly how to get more listeners, more impact, and more sales. Let's get into it. Hey Rhona, how are you? I am so excited you're here. And we actually got in connection with each other from Threads because I saw your Threads post and I was just like, I need to have her on my podcast, because you were talking about your podcast and how you don't really talk about what you do on your show, but you still get inquiries and leads from your show. And I just want to know more about that behind the scenes and how that actually happens for you. And because it's a little bit different from what I teach, because I'm a podcast strategist. So I help coaches, service providers, and consultants podcast. And I look at selling on your podcast like you're providing a service for your listeners. You're helping them, and you can do it without being too salesy. So I love that you flip that on its head, and I want to talk about that. Can you tell me about your podcast a little bit? Before you launched it, what was your idea when you wanted to launch it? What had you hoped for your podcast?
So thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And yeah, like you said, I don't directly sell on my podcast. And when I first started the podcast, I didn't even have the current business that I have now. I was in what I called my like flailing period, where I had my business, then I went back to corporate, then I got laid off. So I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? Type of period. And I've always been a content creator, so I just wanted to create content and I started a podcast. That podcast wasn't really what I wanted to do. I did it for maybe 8 months, and then I took a pause of like a few months, and then I rebranded and did something that aligned more with. In that period, I had started a business, a video content agency, and then I was like, I started my podcast to speak to other creator. So my podcast is called Workfluencer, and it's a play on influencer, but it's people who talk about work in their content and whatever the type of content is. And that's really what my agency focuses on, because we work with corporate clients on employee generated content and also content for like thought leadership for their executives and stuff like that. So the people that are my clients are people who are talking about work online. And that's really how it started. And I feature people, other creators that are killing it in that area, and they're sharing their advice and everything. So was it intentional that it was going to be one of my top business development things? I would be lying if I said that I do. As much as I'm a content strategist, um, with my podcast, I was really just wanting to do it for thought leadership and just really for helping other people create good content. Well, that turned into now it's one of my biggest drivers of business.
Wow, I love that. And having your podcast, how long did it take once you made that pivot into the new podcast before you started seeing leads come in and traction from that show?
I would say like 5 or 6 episodes. But again, you have to remember that I had already started. I didn't do a new podcast feed or anything. I just rebranded the
Okay.
podcast on the same feed. Because it wasn't that different from what I was doing before. So I already had loyal listeners and people knew about it. And then I have a sizable social media following, especially on LinkedIn. So I leveraged that a lot. I just took the same approach that I take with every piece of content and started being intentional about like, okay, the people that I invite on the podcast have to be either ICP or ICP adjacent, meaning their audience is my ICP. And we have to talk about topics that could, yes, I'm the one interviewing, so you're not necessarily seeing all of my opinions and everything, but I'm asking the questions in a way that people understand, like, oh, she knows what she's talking about, type of thing. And that's how people start, they get into my orbit because they see like their favorite influencer that they're following was on my show. They start following me, and then my content has always been directed towards generating leads, and not in a salesy way, but in a, the strategy that you do it. And that's how people come into my orbit. So really like 5 episodes into the new one, I started hearing on sales calls like, oh, I learned about you on so-and-so's episode. I was like, oh, wait. And then I doubled down on making sure it was always aligned to my content strategy.
Awesome. So you would really say that because of your network and because of who you've interviewed and um, your audience is what really helped you blossom your podcast from kind of the little bit of the pivot that you did have, so that you were able to gain traction and then eventually get leads 5 months in. That's awesome. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about when a client comes to you and is a listener, how do they engage with you first? Are they just directly going to your inquiry form, or are they reaching out to you? Are they DMing?
Most of the time, because of how my profiles are set up, people who really want to work with me just go ahead and schedule an intro call. I have like a 20-minute intro call. It's a call to action on most of my profiles. So I'm going to share the journey of one of my latest customers. She heard me on her episode with one of the workfluencers that she really respects. And she saw, because with my guest, I share clips. Again, I own a video content agency, so we do really high quality video production for my podcast. So I shared clips and I share marketing assets that my guests are usually very proud of sharing because how good they are. So she shared that, and then she's like, oh, wow, that video is great. She came to my profile and saw, oh, she does videos. And her first question when she booked the call was, does your agency do the videos for your podcast? And it's like, yeah, we definitely produce it. I also, at the end of every episode, I say this episode or this podcast is produced by Workfluencer Media, stuff like that. So people understand that that's kind of what I do. So if they're looking for that, and again, it's very intentional. I'm inviting people who are either looking for that themselves or have people in their audience that are looking for that. So it just like primes it. So she came and she spoke to me, and it was that way. She's like, I just really love your vibe on your podcast. I came to your profile, saw a few posts, saw what you're doing, and then decided I have to book the call. So she booked the call and she's a client now.
Nice. That's awesome. I love how your strategy is set up for that to exactly happen in that way. And it's just so clear that you've thought about that so intentionally, and that's the journey that they go on. And I talk a lot about what's the journey you want your clients to take when they're listening to the podcast, because I think a lot of podcasters don't even think about that. And then they're sitting there wondering, why is my podcast not converting? So I just love hearing about your strategy or intention there. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your format. And because you've told me a little bit more about your audience and where you were, how did you get to the point to be able to speak to that audience? Like, just take me a little bit further back, maybe. Maybe it's when you were starting your business and you're just so crystal clear on your target client. How does that translate to your ideal client? And how did you understand that that would translate into maybe an audience really enjoying you having interviews on your podcast?
So when I started, I have been working in the talent acquisition industry for many years, and my original podcast was about that. It was about modern ways of recruiting. One of the modern ways of recruiting and attracting talent is creating content. So I started creating some episodes around that and traditional other recruiting methods. But I started noticing that one, I enjoyed those episodes the most, and people were the most engaged in asking the most questions with those episodes. And that's where I was like, okay. And then I had started my agency at that point already. So I was like, okay, I need to double down on this as my topic. Also in my niche, no one else is doing this as of right now. No one else is talking specifically to content creators. It's usually content about, recruiting and all the regular things. So I saw that opportunity there, and that's how I did it. But as a content strategist, it's also when I'm sharing an episode, I don't only share the clips or only share new episode. I incorporate it into my content. So when I send a newsletter, you'll hardly ever see a newsletter from me saying, I interviewed XYZ person. You'll see a topic about how employee generated content is making this person cut through AI and be able to do this, or like that type of thing. So they're interested in that topic. And then as I'm writing my thoughts and my expertise on that topic, oh, by the way, if you want to learn more, I actually spoke about this on my podcast. I have a longer form interview with so and so. So that's how I use my podcast. So people either first find out through an episode, or if they're already in my orbit, they get further nurtured because now a podcast, they're hearing more from me than what they can in a short post or in a reel for a few seconds or on a LinkedIn post, right? So I either funnel from my podcast into my orbit or from people that are already in my orbit to my podcast. And it's just this circular thing where you're building that relationship and that trust that then ends up being, oh, I need to work with this person.
Yes, exactly. It's I love that, the layering of the content, and not saying, "Hey, new podcast is out," or like you said, "I interviewed this person." I mean, which you probably could do that and it probably would work, but this works even better, that you're layering it in, you're bringing in a topic that a lot of people want to hear about, and then adding in, "Hey, by the way, there's an interview with so and so about this topic." So I really think that is just such a smart strategy and such a great way to put out podcast promotion. Yeah, and I talk a lot about that with my clients as well. How do you go about creating episodes? Do you script anything out, or are you just meeting with your guests and going off of vibes and seeing how it goes? What is put into that on the back end?
There's definitely planning because my podcast is YouTube first. Really, the recommendations on YouTube is that you really have to plan and make sure that it's going to be something that's going to work on YouTube, right? So there's a lot of pre-planning as far as that, like keywords and stuff like that. Am I showing up scripted? No. The only thing that I pre-write is like 30-second opener, like intro that I do for the guest that I script. Um, Sometimes it's off the cuff, but like a few seconds before I'm like, let me write this down, and then I do that. I definitely plan themes, not necessarily questions. So I send my guest a prep doc where I share the backstory of what I'm thinking for the episode. And I'm saying, after, and this is after all of my research of what I think is going to work on both social media, YouTube, and podcast platforms, then I'm like, okay, the way I'm thinking about this episode is we're going to talk about XYZ and these things. And I've already met with most of my guests before in a pre-planning meeting. Unless I really know the person, I always have a pre-planning meeting. So we're on the same page of what we're going to be talking about. And then I have bullet points of the main themes that I'm going to touch on. And maybe I pre-plan like the first question, but then that's it. Everything is based on what the guest says. My main pet peeve is when you listen to a podcast and you can tell that the host pre-planned everything. And let's say the guest says something that wasn't something that they were planning on asking, and they don't dig deeper. That's my pet peeve. So to avoid that, I don't pre-plan questions. I pre-plan themes. I also don't send my guests questions ahead of time because I used to do that, but I always go off script because it depends on what they answer. So it's just a conversation, and that's the way that I do it, and that's what my audience has really liked.
Yeah. I think that is a good point to make about interviews. I think a lot of people feel, I mean, my audience, they feel that interviews seem so much easier and they don't have to actually think about what happens. They could just, hang out with someone and kind of chit chat and then post it and think that's an actual episode, where you're saying, I actually do the work. I look at who the guests are. I make sure that I understand them before they even come onto my podcast. I'm doing a prep and I talk to them beforehand. And I think that's so important, knowing that you guys have that chemistry, right? Before they even step on, especially because you have a YouTube channel. So I think it's so important for you not to look awkward on video as well, right?
Yeah.
So you're not just showing up and being like, oh, and you don't know how that person looks on camera. I think that's really important. And also, do you have any pet peeves? Like if someone doesn't have a microphone, how do you deal with that?
No, I mean, at the end of the day, because of what I'm doing, because I'm interviewing other creators, most of them have good equipment or they've invested in equipment, in some sort of equipment. Some people might not have a microphone, but they have like a amazing camera and microphones. As long as it's decent enough, we can do a lot in editing to fix that. Obviously, it's great when someone has a microphone that's a professional microphone, but that's not something that I'm worried about, to be honest. Now, if someone shows up to an interview and the audio is bad or the video is terrible, I will reschedule because it's a waste of our time. It really is.
Definitely, definitely.
Because I
And do you
won't
know,
publish anything that's not
yeah.
up to my standards.
Right. Yes. And that was actually my next question for you. I was going to ask you, what are your non-negotiables for your podcast? Because at the level that your podcast is at, I know that when you put so much intention into it, so what are your standards and what won't you let go of?
My standards are the video has to be crisp, or decent, right? And the audio has to be clear. That's it. And the person has to be seen. If you are, I don't know, like if it seems like you're in a submarine and I can hear the water and stuff like that, no one wants to hear that. No one wants that in their ears. No one's going to watch that on YouTube. And I'm not that specific or like that picky as people might think, because there's a lot that we can do in editing to fix it. But there's just those basic things. Like you have to have good lighting. If you're in a place that's super dark and we can't fix that, and I know that, I'm just going to ask you to either turn on some lights, open a window or something. And if it's impossible, then we have to record a different day.
So that is interesting. because I am more of a audio first girly. I just got my podcast, part of it, a little series on YouTube. So I am learning the whole thing about YouTube. But being audio first, video is definitely intriguing to a lot of my listeners. Um, they love the idea of starting a podcast with video. Um, did you start out right away with video or did you implement it a little later?
I started with video. I'm a video person and I've always I'm not going to say always, but like if you knew a little bit of my story, I'm from Panama in Central America. And when I moved to the United States, I was midway through my career. I was regional operations manager, everything doing well. And then I fell in love with someone who happened to want to move back here to the US. And when I came, I knew no one. And I'm in a state that's not necessarily like the most immigrant friendly. So I was struggling to get a job because it's like you're seeing this resume where it's like, yeah, these great roles, but I don't know any of these companies. I don't know this person. And honestly, because I work in the recruiting industry, I also know they had no one to call and ask, like, do you know this girl type of thing. So they're not going to hire me as a manager because they don't know me. They don't know who I am. So what I did after frustration of years of interview or like applying, not even getting interviews, was I created a video. And that video just opened so many doors for me. And ever since that, I've always used video for any time I wanted to do anything, whether it be my business or my career or marketing. Video has always been the center of the strategy. So when I started a podcast, naturally it was video first.
Oh, awesome. So, looking forward to the future, what would you say that you're hoping for your podcast? It just being started in 2024. What are you hoping that you might be able to achieve or maybe change a little bit of?
So it's interesting. I've been looking at podcast metrics, which I usually typically don't look at as much, but I've been seeing that my audience is pretty loyal. I have like between 55 and 60% returning listeners for every episode, which I think is great. New listeners is amazing, but just talking to a strategist yesterday, he was telling me that most podcasts have a bunch of new listeners and not necessarily returning. Well, I have that loyalty from my audience because they're returning and they're listening back and back, and it's been growing month after month. So I want to continue on that path. That's where I'm doubling on. I'm really focused on loyalty, so return listeners. Obviously, new listeners, you always want to be discovered. But also, I'm really doubling down on retention and just testing out different things that make me see in the metrics that people are listening to more and more of the episode. Because there's lots of podcasts out there who are getting thousands of downloads, and then their average listen time for an episode is like less than a minute. And people aren't returning to listen to it. To me, that's just a waste of effort because you're just always having to find the new person, always having to find the new person. So I want to double down on my strategy on keeping people coming back and keeping them listening more and more and more of the episodes.
Right. And I think it's just so clear that you do have that with your listeners because you're being able to have leads come in from your podcast. And that doesn't happen if you're just getting newbies week
Yeah.
after week, you know, it just doesn't. So that's awesome that you're looking at those numbers and focusing on them and trying to lengthen the retention time because that's something I really often talk about with my clients as well is we need to see how what we might be able to tweak so that that might be a little bit longer.
Also, those
Yeah.
those loyal listeners are the ones that share the episodes without me ever prompting or asking
Yep.
for it. I wake up almost daily to someone sharing an episode like, "Oh my gosh, did you hear this? You need to go catch this episode." It's the returning people who are sharing it because
Yep.
very rarely someone's going to listen to you for the first time and share it. It does happen, but it's more the loyal listeners that keep sharing it over and over. So more people get to be in your orbit and in your circle.
It's word of mouth is the most powerful. And that's such a good thing to note that that's how it's getting even stronger. Yeah. Awesome.
Yes.
Rhona, thank you so much. I would love if you would tell my audience how to get a hold of you and if you want to share anything else.
Yeah, so I've loved this conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I'm mostly on LinkedIn, Rhona Pierce, and my podcast is workfluencerpodcast.com. You'll find all the links there. And I'm also Workfluencer Pod on Instagram and Rhona B. Pierce everywhere else, as far as like my personal profiles for like Threads, Instagram, everywhere.
Thank you so much, Rhona. You have given so much value to my audience and have given them so many great tips. And I love what you're doing. And yeah, so happy to have you on the podcast. Thanks.
Thank you.
What I hope you got from today's conversation with Rhona isn't that she doesn't sell on her podcast. It's that nothing about her show is accidental. The clarity is doing the work. Her podcast knows who it's for, what kind of conversations are on it, and where it fits in the rest of her business. And that's really the point of today's show. The question isn't whether your podcast is supposed to be selling more or less. It's whether your podcast strategy actually matches the business you're building. There isn't one right approach, but there is a right fit. Thank you for being here with me today. And next week, I'm going to pull a little bit more on this thread and talk about what happens when overthinking replaces direction and how a lot of podcasters get stalled right there. I'll see you then. If you've enjoyed this show, come hang with me on my list. That's where I share deeper strategies, behind the scenes stories, and even access to everything I'm working on. No fluff, just what's working for podcasts right now. Head to the link in the show notes to join the email fam.